There's a quote that lives at the heart of this message, one that Carl Jung offered with piercing clarity. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. On the surface, it sounds simple, even beautiful. But for most of us, that journey is anything but easy. Because long before we ever ask ourselves, who am I really? We are already asking something else. Am I good enough? Do they like me? Will I be accepted? We learn, often without words, that love and approval are closely tied, that to belong, we must behave, fit in, the shaping of ourselves into what we forget, as Jung reminds us, that the goal is not perfection, but wholeness. This is where everything begins to shift, not when we chase more approval, but when we begin to ask, what happens when I stop needing it? Most of us grow up being told how to act, what to say, and who to be, in order to be liked, accepted, and validated. It's subtle at first. A smile when we do something right, a frown when we don't, a reward for good behavior, and quiet disapproval when we step out of line. Over time, that conditioning becomes internalized. We start to measure ourselves based on what others reflect back to us. We unconsciously ask, what will they think of me if I do this? It's easy to see how this mindset becomes the norm. We live in a world that constantly reminds us to seek approval from parents, teachers, friends, co-workers, bosses, and now, more than ever, strangers online. Every like, every comment, every nod of agreement becomes a tiny hit of validation. And each time we get it, we feel temporarily reassured that we are enough. But the problem is, that reassurance never lasts. It's conditional, it's fragile, and it makes us dependent. When we chase approval, we hand over the reins of our identity. We allow other people, many of whom don't even truly know us, to decide how we should show up in the world. We dim our opinions, mute our instincts, and edit our personalities in real time, just to keep fitting in. It's a quiet erosion of the self that often goes unnoticed until the fatigue sets in, until we feel the emptiness that comes from performing instead of living. This performance takes different shapes. Some of us become perfectionists, always doing more, working harder, trying to be flawless, in hopes that we'll finally earn the praise we crave. Others become people pleasers, constantly accommodating, afraid to rock the boat or say no. And some simply go silent. They stop expressing what they truly feel because the fear of judgment is too heavy. And here's the catch. Even when we get the approval, it doesn't satisfy us in the way we hope it will. It's like drinking salt water. You might feel quenched for a moment, but deep down, you're still thirsty. Because what we really want, what we truly long for, isn't someone else's validation. It's permission to stop trying so hard, permission to breathe. But most of us are waiting for that permission to come from the outside. We're waiting for someone to say, "You're good enough now. You can relax." The truth is, that moment never arrives, not in a lasting way. The world is too inconsistent. One day people love you, the next you criticize you. One day you're admired, the next you're misunderstood. Basing your worth on others' opinions is like building a house on sand. It doesn't hold. That's why approval seeking is such a trap. It tricks us into thinking we're building something solid when we're actually just stacking cards. One wrong move, one disapproving glance, one comment taken the wrong way, and the whole thing comes crashing down. We're left questioning ourselves, doubting our decisions, and sometimes even regretting things we didn't really want to do in the first place. The irony is, in our effort to be liked by everyone, we end up losing the very thing that makes us most likable: our authenticity. People can sense when we're not being real. They can feel when we're trying too hard, and while they might not always name it, that energy creates a subtle distance, a feeling that something's off, even if they can't put their finger on it. On the other hand, when you meet someone who isn't chasing approval, it's unmistakable. There's a groundedness in them. They're not trying to win you over, and yet you find yourself drawn to them. They speak with clarity. They listen without trying to impress. They show up not as a curated version of themselves, but as they are. And in their presence, you feel safe to do the same. That kind of presence doesn't come from a secret formula or years of external success. It comes from one simple, radical shift: choosing to stop measuring your worth by how others respond to you, choosing to no longer treat approval as the currency of your self-esteem, choosing to be the one who says, "I see you, I accept you. You are enough," even when no one else does. I remember a moment in my own life when I realized how much of what I had built was rooted in the need to be seen a certain way. It was an easy realization. There was grief in it. Grief for all the versions of myself I had abandoned just to keep the peace. Grief for the dreams I had edited nor delayed because I feared how they would be received. But there was also relief, because once you see the trap, you no longer have to keep walking into it. And that's when things begin to change. When you stop chasing approval, you start attracting something far more powerful: alignment, integrity, freedom. You begin to live from the inside out instead of the outside in. And that changes everything. When we begin to recognize the weight that approval-seeking places on our lives, the next natural question is, why? Why do we care so deeply about being accepted? Why does someone else's opinion have the power to shake our confidence, alter our behavior, or determine whether we feel worthy? That answer, more often than not, is rooted somewhere much deeper. Human beings don't arrive in this world with an inherent obsession for validation. We are born whole, curious, open, and uninhibited. We laugh freely. We cry when we need to. We explore without shame. But slowly and subtly, we start to learn the rules. We learn that behaviors are met with love, isn't earnest silence or punishment. We learn that being too many feelings is inconvenient, that wanting something differed makes us, and when we're young, we don't question these lessons, we absorb them. As children, we are entirely dependent on the people around us, not just for physical survival, but for emotional belonging. So when that belonging feels at risk, we adapt, we shrink, we perform, we hide. And we do it not because we're weak, but because we're incredibly intelligent. We learn to survive emotionally in the only way we can, by becoming what we think others want us to be. That survival strategy becomes a blueprint, and we carry it forward into adulthood, often without realizing we're still operating from it. This is how people-pleasing is born. This is where perfectionism takes root, not because we're flawed, but because, at some level, we believed that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that our worth was something negotiable, something we had to prove. And so we keep adjusting. We keep asking, sometimes silently, is this version of me acceptable? And the more we seek approval, the more distant we become from our own internal compass. We stop asking ourselves what we truly feel or want or value because we're too busy scanning the room for reactions. We live from the outside, expressions, comments, nods, and because we've been doing it for so long, we begin to confuse approval with truth. If someone approves of us, we must be doing something right. If they don't, we must be wrong. And so the cycle deepens. But here's the truth. That constant chasing, that deep-rooted fear of rejection, that sensitivity to judgment, it isn't a personality flaw. It's a wound that came from learning, somewhere along the way, that who we naturally were wasn't fully safe to be. And that wound doesn't heal away when someone tells you you're good enough. It only begins to dissolve when you understand where it came from, when you stop treating it as something shameful and begin to see it as the brilliant, adaptive part of you that did the best it could to be loved. We are not wrong for wanting connection. We're not wrong for wanting to be seen, to be valued, to belong. That desire is human. But when the need for approval becomes the lens through which we define ourselves, we end up giving away the very thing we are trying to protect, our self-worth. And the paradox is, the more we look outside ourselves for confirmation, the more disconnected we become from the source that matters most, our own inner truth. So the work, if we're brave enough to do it, is not to silence that need entirely. It's to turn toward it, to ask it what it's afraid of, to ask it where it came from, to meet it with compassion, not criticism. Because when you stop judging the part of you that's always been seeking approval and instead begin to understand it, that's when the pattern starts to loosen and something else begins to emerge. A quiet, steady voice inside that's been there all along, just waiting for the noise to die down. It says, you don't have to prove anything. You don't have to earn your place. You're allowed to belong to yourself first. That voice doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be heard. It's soft, but it's real. And when you begin to listen to it more than the applause or the criticism around you, everything starts to shift. You begin to choose differently, speak differently, move differently, not to gain approval, but to honor what's true for you. And while the fear of rejection doesn't vanish overnight, it loses its grip, because the more you understand the root of that fear, the less it defines you. You begin to recognize it not as a signal to change who you are, but as an invitation to return to who you have always been, beneath the need to be accepted. And that's where freedom starts. Once you begin to uncover the roots of why you seek approval, the next realization often comes with a heavy dose of clarity. The life you've been living might not actually be yours. It may look successful, even admirable from the outside, but if you peel back the layers, much of it was built not on desire, but on expectation. And the deeper you look, the more you see the quiet cost of living for others. It shows up in the small compromises that add up over time. The career you chose because it made your parents proud, not because it set your soul on fire. The relationships you stayed in because walking away might disappoint someone. The silence you maintained in moments when speaking your truth might have challenged the room. On the surface, these choices seem like the path of least resistance, but underneath, they take something from you each time. A little piece of energy, a little piece of honesty, a little piece of yourself. And what's tricky is that it doesn't always feel dramatic. Often, it feels normal. You go along, you show up, you do what's expected, you're agreeable, you're dependable, you're liked, and because no one questions you, because you've become so good at being what others want, you rarely question yourself. But then there are those moments, late at night or in quiet spaces, or when you're alone long enough to hear your own thoughts. There's a dull ache, a restlessness, a voice that whispers, this isn't quite it. And it's not dissatisfaction with everything. It's just this haunting sense that saying, that's the cost of living for others. You can win their approval and still feel empty. You can follow all the rules and still feel lost. Because even if the version of you that others accept is doing well, if it's not the real you, then the praise feels hollow. It lands on the surface, but doesn't sink in. You smile when they applaud you, but inside, a deeper part of you wonders what it would be like to be seen without the mask. We often underestimate how much energy it takes to keep that mask in place, to constantly scan the room, to adjust your tone, to hide certain opinions, to agree when you want to question. It's exhausting, and eventually, that exhaustion turns into resentment, not always toward others, but toward yourself. You start to feel like a guest in your own life, but never fully chose. And the longer you live that way, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before you started editing yourself. There is a grief in that, a quiet mourning for the parts of you that were never given permission to come forward. The version of you that didn't need to impress, the version that was wild, creative, unsure, real. You start to see how often you traded clarity for comfort, truth for safety, connection for performance, and you wonder, if I had said what I really thought, if I had pursued what I really wanted, where might I be now? But this realization, painful as it is, isn't the end. In fact, it's the beginning. Because the moment you see how much you've lost by trying to live someone else's version of success, you get to decide, truly decide, if you want to keep going that way. And that decision is powerful. It may start small. You speak up in a meeting when you normally would have stayed quiet. You say no to an invitation without an excuse. You wear what you want without wondering if it's too much. You start choosing based on alignment, not applause. And something begins to shift. Your energy changes. Your posture changes. The people who resonate with the real you start to show up, and the ones who only liked your performance begin to fade away. That's a painful part of the process too. Losing relationships that were never built on truth. But what you gain in return is worth it. Space. Space to breathe. Space to feel. Space to finally be. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be considerate or to make people happy. But when making people happy comes at the expense of your own peace, it becomes a form of quiet self-abandonment, and the longer you do it, the more distant you become from yourself, until one day you don't even need anyone else to silence you. You've learned to do it on your own. That's when you know it's time to stop. Living for others might keep you comfortable, but it won't make you whole. Approval might keep you safe, but it will never make you free. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, is my peace worth more than their praise? Because when the answer is yes, everything begins to change. There comes a moment when something inside you shifts, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible snap. It's the moment you stop asking, what will they think of me? And start asking, what do I think of me? And when that shift happens, when you stop looking outward to be told who you are or what you're worth, you begin to reclaim something sacred, your power. The truth is, approval-seeking slowly chips away at that power. Every time you silence yourself to be liked, every time you go along to get along, you give away a little bit of it. Not all at once, but in pieces. And after a while, you might still be functioning. You might even look successful on the surface, but inwardly you feel diminished, like a dimmed light that once burned under the weight of constant performance. But power, real power, is not something you get from applause. It doesn't come from others nodding in agreement, or from being admired, or from fitting in. Real power rises when you begin to stand rooted in your own sense of truth, even when it goes unnoticed or unapproved. It shows up when you realize you don't need someone else's permission to be yourself. That's where everything begins to change, not externally at first, but internally. Decisions that once felt complicated suddenly become clearer, not because the outside world becomes any less noisy, but because your own voice starts getting louder. You stop asking, what should I do to be accepted? And start asking, what aligns with who I really am? And once that becomes your compass, you begin to live with a kind of clarity that approval can never offer. Reclaiming your power doesn't mean becoming arrogant or unkind. It doesn't mean you stop listening or caring about others. It simply means you stop betraying yourself to earn temporary belonging. It means you trust your gut more than you trust the shifting opinions around you. You begin to take responsibility, not for what others think of you, but for how true you're being to yourself. There's a deep kind of strength in that, not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the kind that no longer needs to apologize, the kind that shows up quietly, but unmistakably, in the way you speak, the way you move, the way you carry your own weight, without waiting for someone to approve of how you're doing it. And yes, at first, that shift can feel unsettling. When you stop seeking approval, people might not know how to respond to the new version of you, the version that doesn't automatically bend to fit their expectations. You may find that some people resist the change. They liked the version of you that was easier to manage, easier to predict. But that discomfort is part of the process. It's not a sign you're doing something honest. And with honesty comes freedom. When you no longer need to edit yourself to be accepted, you start living without hesitation. You start speaking without calculating. You start creating without fearing what someone might say. Your energy returns. Your confidence, the real kind, not the one built on being liked, starts to take shape. It's simply you, without apology, without performance, without the exhausting chase for someone else's nod. That's when life gets lighter. Not easier, necessarily, but lighter, because you're no longer carrying the burden of pretending. You're no longer second-guessing every word, every choice, every step. You move through the world knowing that you may not be for everyone, and you're finally okay with that. You stop managing people's perceptions and start honoring your own. It's ironic, really. The moment you stop needing approval is often the moment you become someone others are drawn to more deeply, not because you're trying to impress them, but because you're embodying something rare: authenticity. People are starving for it, and when they see it, they feel it gives them permission to do the same. But even if no one applauds, even if no one notices, it's still worth it, because reclaiming your power isn't about proving anything. It's not about being loud or making a statement. It's about remembering that you were never meant to live your life at the mercy of what other people think. It's about choosing peace over performance, choosing alignment over approval, choosing you, not just occasionally, but as a way of being. And once you've tasted that kind of power, the quiet, grounded kind that comes from within, you'll never want to trade it again. Confidence is one of those things we're all told to have, but few are ever taught how to cultivate. We're taught to act like we have it, to speak up, to appear certain, even when we're full of doubt inside. And so many people go through life wearing confidence like a mask, hoping it becomes real. Confidence doesn't come from pretending to be sure of yourself. It doesn't come from achievement or praise or a perfectly curated image. Real confidence begins to take root the moment you stop needing approval to validate your worth. Until that point, what we often call confidence is really just control. Control over how we're perceived, control over outcomes, control over how much of ourselves we're willing to show. But that's a fragile foundation. It requires constant effort. It's fueled by performance and fear of rejection, fear of not being good enough. And anything built on fear cannot last. So what we're left with is not true confidence, but a temporary illusion of it, one that crumbles as soon as someone disapproves or misunderstands us. But when you stop seeking approval, something powerful happens. You start trusting your own experience. You begin to notice that your thoughts, your feelings, your instincts, they're not things to question or suppress. They're guides. You stop outsourcing your self-worth to other people's reactions. And that's when confidence, real, steady, unshakable confidence, begins to emerge. Not because everyone agrees with yourself. It's subtle at first. You say what you really think, and even if the room goes quiet, you don't feel like shrinking. You make a choice based on what feels right, not what will get the most approval. And you sleep better at night. You stop apologizing for things that don't require apology. You realize that not being liked by everyone isn't a crisis. It's a sign that you're finally being authentic. The confidence built, without approval, seeking feels different in your body. It's calm. It doesn't need to dominate or persuade. It doesn't get rattled every time someone disagrees. It becomes a quiet inner knowing, a sense that you're okay no matter how the world responds. But the fear no longer leads, and the doubt no longer defines you. You stop walking on eggshells and start walking in alignment. And something else begins to happen. You take more risks, not reckless ones, but meaningful ones. You raise your hand when you used to hold back. You create the project, send the message, speak up in the moment, even if your voice shakes a little. Because you're no longer waiting to feel 100% confident before you act. You understand that real confidence is built through action, not before it. You grow by doing the thing that once scared you, not by waiting until you're perfectly ready. And when you do fail, and you will, you don't spiral the way you used to. You don't collapse under the weight of one misstep. Because your sense of self isn't built on flawless performance. It's built on a deeper relationship with yourself, one that can weather embarrassment, mistakes, even disapproval. You learn that failure isn't a reflection of who you are. It's part of the process. It's feedback. And when you're no longer trying to be perfect to earn approval, failure stops feeling like a threat to your identity. You also start noticing who you become around other people. You used to shapeshift to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid discomfort. But now, you notice when you're doing it, you catch yourself before you go too far, and eventually, you just stop, because the version of you that requires shrinking or exaggerating to be liked no longer feels worth maintaining. Confidence makes you more consistent. You're the same person in every room, not because you're stubborn, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself just to belong. There's a kind of magnetism that comes from this. People start noticing not just what you say, but how you carry yourself. And it's not about charisma, it's about congruence. People are drawn to those who are real, not because they're trying to impress anyone, but because they're at peace with who they are. There's no second guessing, no grasping, and that's the heart of it. Confidence is not about being the loudest voice or the most impressive person in the room. It's about being rooted in yourself. It's about knowing that you have the right to be here just as you are, without needing to earn your place. When you stop needing everyone's approval, you give yourself full permission to show up, and the world in turn starts to respond to you, not to the version you once thought they wanted. And in that, everything changes. There is something ironic about relationships. We spend so much time trying to be what others want us to be in order to be loved. But in doing that, we often lose the very thing that makes love possible, our authenticity. When you seek approval constantly, relationships may seem smooth on the surface, but underneath, there's distance. Not always physical or visible distance, but the emotional space created by self-solicitude, by the pressure to be greedy rather than honest. When you stop seeking approval, something remarkable begins to happen. Not just inside you, but between you and other people. The masks start to come off. The performance ends. You stop walking into conversations trying to be the version of yourself you think they'll like. Instead, you bring your real self, and that changes the tone of everything. Interactions become less about impressing and more about connecting. You're no longer performing for a reaction. You're participating from presence. At first, this shift can feel risky. You might say what you truly think and fear how someone will take it. You might admit you're unsure or tired or different than they assumed, and that vulnerability feels like walking a tightrope without a net. But as soon as you step into that kind of honesty, the relationships that are meant for you will arise to meet you. They'll adjust. The ones that existed on the surface might pull away, but the ones that have the capacity for depth will become more real, more grounded, more alive. Because when you show up without needing to be approved of, you offer something rare. Truth, and truth invites truth. When you stop trying to be perfect or polished, you create space for others to be human too. Your courage gives them permission to lower their guard. That's where real connection lives. Not in performance, not in creature to be. Relationships built on approval seeking tend to feel fragile. One wrong opinion, one mistake, and things can feel like they're cracking. But when the foundation is honesty, there's room to disagree. There's room for complexity, for nuance, for growth. You don't have to constantly manage how you're being perceived because you trust that the people who are truly aligned with you will stay, not because they are convenient, but because you also start to notice how much more energy you have when you're not monitoring every word, every reaction, every facial expression. You listen more fully because you're not rehearsing your response. You speak more clearly because you're not editing yourself mid-sentence. You're present, not calculating, and the person in front of you feels that. They feel your honesty, and they often respond with their own. That exchange, authentic presence, meeting authentic presence, is where intimacy is born. Approval seeking can also breed resentment, quietly and over time. You say yes when you want to say no. You agree just to keep the peace. You hold in frustration because you don't want to be seen as difficult. But all of that builds. Eventually, even the smallest requests start to feel heavy. But because you've never set boundaries, you are too busy trying to be liked. And when resentment grows, connection dies. Approval might keep things polite, but it kills closeness. On the other hand, when you stop trying to be liked and start trying to be real, you begin to communicate differently. You say no when something doesn't feel right, not to push people away, but to protect your energy. You express your needs not as demands, but as honest invitations. You own your emotions instead of hiding them behind a smile. And in doing that, you create clarity. And clarity is one of the kindest things you can offer in any relationship. Some people won't like this new version of you, not because you've become harsh, but because they were attached to the version of you who never challenged them. That's okay. Let them go. The space they leave behind makes room for people who want to be in relationship with the real you, not the edited, filtered, agreeable version, but the full, complex, vibrant one. That kind of relationship might be fewer in number, but the depth is incomparable. What becomes clear over time is that relationships built on truth are not only more fulfilling, they are also more resilient. They are not shaken every time there's a disagreement. They are not threatened by imperfection. They grow through honesty, through shared humanity, through the trust that comes from knowing you're not being managed or manipulated, but met. And the beautiful, unexpected twist is this: the less you seek approval, the more love you actually receive. Not the love you had to perform for, but the kind that comes freely, because you finally had the courage to stop hiding who you are. That's when connection becomes real. There's a moment, sometimes so subtle you almost miss it, when you realize you're no longer living to be understood. You're living to be true. You stop rearranging yourself to fit the preferences of others. You stop scanning the room for signs that you're doing life the right way. You stop waiting for someone to say, yes, this version of you exhales for the first time in a very long time. When you stop seeking approval, you don't just reclaim your voice or your power. You begin to live authentically. Not as an act of rebellion, not to prove anything, but because it finally feels like the only honest way to move through the world. And that changes everything. It changes the way you relate to yourself, the way you show up in your relationships, the way you experience success, and even the way you understand peace. Authenticity isn't about being loud or bold or edgy. It's not about standing out. It's about being aligned. It's about your outer life starting to match your inner truth. No more pretending. No more performing. No more shaping your opinions or values based on how they'll be received. Is no longer driven by the question, is this real for me? And when that becomes your compass, everything you do becomes more grounded, more meaningful, more alive. You stop wasting energy trying to read minds, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to hold together a version of yourself that isn't sustainable. Instead, your energy goes toward what actually matters: creating, connecting, growing, and resting. Without guilt. You start to make decisions based on intuition, not on fear. You move because you feel called to, not because you're being chased by the need to be accepted. And that's when peace arrives, not the temporary kind you get when people approve of you, but the deep kind that settles in when you know you're no longer abandoning yourself. That kind of peace doesn't depend on circumstances or applause. It doesn't fade when people don't understand you. It stays because it's rooted in integrity. You're no longer split between who you are and who you think you need to be. That inner conflict dissolves. You feel whole again. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. Authenticity doesn't shield you from challenge or criticism. In fact, it might even draw more of it at first. When you stop playing the role others expect, you disrupt the comfort of predictability. Some people won't like it. They may question you, resist the changes, even withdraw. But the difference is, this time, you don't bend to make them stay. You trust that anyone who can't meet the rule you doesn't belong in the next chapter of your life. And you also begin to understand that fulfillment is no longer measured by how much praise you receive, but by how much you feel at home in your own life. You could be doing something simple, cooking, walking, building something quietly, and feel more satisfied than you ever did chasing approval in crowded rooms. Because it's not about how impressive it looks from the outside. It's about how right it feels on the inside. When you live authentically, you also start to notice joy in unexpected places. You're no longer numb from trying to be someone you're not. Your senses wake up again. You feel more, you laugh more freely, you cry more honestly. You stop numbing discomfort and start moving through it with grace, because you're no longer afraid that struggle makes you less worthy. You know that being human, fully dispolluted, is not something to apologize for. And maybe the most beautiful part of all, you become someone others feel safe to be real around. When you stop seeking approval, you create space for others to do the same. Your presence becomes an invitation. People start opening up around you, not because you're a performer, but because you're not. There's nothing to perform for. That kind of authenticity is contagious. It spreads, quietly but powerfully, and it transforms not just individuals, but communities. So what changes when you stop seeking approval? Everything. Not all at once, but piece by piece. You get your time back, your voice back, your clarity back. You stop asking permission to be who you are. You stop holding your breath, waiting to be picked. You start living like someone who already belongs, because you finally understand you always did. And from that place, life opens, not because it becomes perfect, but because it finally becomes yours.